You may have heard some of these stories before on this channel. And if you think you have, you probably have. This is my first Stories Remade video. These stories are older. They're not ancient. I haven't been doing this for very long, so I can't say they're ancient, but they come from a time when my narration style was very different, so in the end, I think it's a good idea to breathe some new life into these stories, and I have a couple of these planned for this month, so hopefully you all enjoy them, and of course, listener discretion is advised, as some of these do have some disturbing content. But, yeah, here we go. This actually happened to me a few years ago. I started working at a local gas station part-time after high school. I figured if I was staying home, I might as well do something productive and make my own money, too. Most shifts were at night, so they were either dead or full of drunks, but I usually worked with one other person, so it wasn't too bad. Especially when we had people get out of hand. I actually liked it for the most part. On the slower nights, I let the neat freak in me come out, and I would start to organize the shelves better so that everything was lined up right, not scattered around and piled up. There was one guy, Mark, that usually worked the nights with me, and he would play music on his phone so that it wasn't completely silent, which was nice. One downfall, though, was that I didn't have a car anymore, as mine finally died on me, so I had to rely on rides from my parents, friends, or sometimes an Uber to get to places. Still, it was manageable, because I only worked a few miles away from my home, so I could even walk there if needed. I believe it was in late September when this happened, because it wasn't too hot, but it was starting to get cooler overnight. I had decided to walk to work since it was nice out, and my parents weren't home to take me anyways. It was a normal shift, except it was also football season, so we were a bit busier before games started, dead while it was on, and then we would get a quick burst of people at the end. As I'm ringing people up, I look up to see my line, and I noticed a guy in basketball shorts, socks with sandals on, and a shirt that said something about the gun show. Eye roll, am I right? He was looking right at me and smiling, so I just smiled back and continued working on the line. After a few, I looked back and noticed that the line wasn't going down, so I called for Mark to come up and help. Sandal guy was next. I noticed he had one of those tall cans of tea and nothing else, and he was still smiling, so I just said, sorry you had to wait just for this. Without taking his eyes off me, he said, "Oh, it's alright, sweetie, as long as I get to see your beautiful smile." I haven't really dated much, nor have I had much experience in flirting, so I didn't really know how to react. Not to mention, he had to be close to my parents' age, so I just made some weird chuckling sound and didn't say another word. He paid with a card. I handed him his receipt without saying another word to him, and he said, "Good night, sweetie," and walked out. I didn't have time to process what happened, as I had a few more people in line, so I just continued until we cleared out again. When I was done, I was about to ask Mark to help me with something when he said, "Oh, sure, sweetie." He was a nice guy. We never had problems with each other, so I knew that he was teasing, but it snapped me back to that when I started laughing and asked, "So you saw that too? Was that not weird?" He said that he thought the dude was weird, but the flustered side of me was adorable. Funny to him, but I didn't know what to say, and the guy was just off, so none of it was enjoyable to me. Our night went back to normal for a while. He was in the back again as he did some of the book work, while I was messing with the shelves. We were kind of shouting back and forth about something that we were both really involved in when someone came in. I started walking back around the counter when I noticed it was Sandal Guy again. He noticed me and waved, so I waved back and he started walking towards the coolers in the back. I quickly made a comment to Mark about him being there and just waited for the dreadful checkout. He then walked up to the counter and said, "Huh, I forgot to get gas." If that was the case, why did he walk to the back? I just smiled and rang him up. As I handed him his receipt, he made sure to reach further in to touch my hand and said, "I'm glad I decided to stop here tonight," and smiled as he shook my hand. My hand was limp because I was not interested in this at all. At this point, Mark had walked out from the back and said, "Hey Kate, my part's done. I'll take over." Thank God. I pulled my arm back really quick and dashed to the back and waited. I didn't hear another word from the guy, but I heard the bell on the door and Mark walked to the back. He said when I turned around, the guy cocked his head like he was trying to look at my back end when he walked in front of his view. He said that when he noticed this, he grabbed his candy and dashed out the door. Who does this right in front of people, though? Anyways, the rest of the night was okay again. We had some lady come in singing, and she got Mark to sing with her, so that was funny. We were just having a good time, and it was getting close to closing, so Mark had taken the trash out back so we could smoke, and I was up front again reading a magazine. To my surprise, Sandals walks in. Again. It had to show on my face that I was not okay with this, but he again immediately smiled and was looking around quickly like he was trying to find something. And that's when he grabbed another candy bar and said, "For you, Catherine Lee. I cannot stay away. Can I give you a ride home so that we can talk?" I was shocked. My name badge says Kate. I don't go by Catherine nor my middle name, so how would he have known that? I didn't know how to reply, so I just said, "No thanks, I have a ride." To which he said, "But you walked here, right?" How would he have known that? I just told him that I had a ride, and he would not stop, saying that he wanted to get to know me more and to take care of me. I remind you, I was around 19 years old, and this guy could have been my dad. I tried cutting him off to ask him if he was going to purchase anything when he reached for my hand again and I pulled back. At this point, Mark walked back in right as he was starting to plead. Mark immediately walked over to the guy, telling him that he needed to go. He started shouting as he was being pushed out that he would wait for me. Mark locked the door and made sure that I was okay, but I was just more shaken up than anything. He had me doing some other things from there, like more organizing, stocking, anything that was empty, and mopping while he watched the door. He would unlock the door to let specific people in and then lock it again. At closing, he was finishing the last things, so I had pulled out my phone and opened Facebook when I noticed I had a friend request. It was the Sandals guy. That's when I figured out where he knew my name from, and also realized that my address was on there. I told Mark about this, and he suggested that he should take me home. I did not refuse, either. As we left, I was looking around to see if he was waiting, but I never saw anyone. As he was driving, he tried to loosen up the tension and joke with me, but I think that we were both worried about it still. Once we got to my place, the lights were on, so I knew that my parents were still up, thankfully, and I noticed Mark was still out there when I had gone in and locked the door. I thought it was just to make sure that I got in okay, and after I was in, I changed clothes and went to get something to eat when there was a knock on the door. It was the cops. They were explaining that there was a report of a suspicious person and gave the description of the vehicle and the person. Wouldn't you know it? It was the same guy. So I had to explain to the cops and my parents what had happened. The cops said they would drive around a few times to make sure that he didn't come back, and thankfully, he didn't. But they did tell us that if he did come back to call them. Unfortunately, there was little that they could do since he hadn't actually done anything. The next time I worked, though, Mark explained what had happened. He said that he noticed a car following us, but didn't want to say anything and scare me. After I got inside, he saw the truck turn the corner onto my road, so he got out of his car and noticed that it was the same guy as he was driving by. He said that he thinks he recognized him too, as he started to speed up. So, he called the cops to report it for us. I was so incredibly thankful for what he did. Thankfully, we never saw the guy again, so hopefully he got the hint, but you can bet that I did a full cleanup of my Facebook page. My uncle was an officer on a narcotics team that was tasked, basically, with finding who was selling the hard drugs in this town, and building a case against them so that they could set up stings and take them down. He was pretty good at it, and he had taken some decent-sized dealers off the streets. A lot of his cases were based on anonymous tips, with names doing deals in X, Y, or Z areas. They would then tail the person, and once they were satisfied that they had someone they could get, they would typically set up a sting, record a sale, and then go for the bust pretty much immediately after. Most of the time, this went perfectly. They would get the sale on the video, and would have the probable cause to arrest the dealer right away. And more often than not, it would be a quick and easy arrest and a straightforward case. This case was actually one of my uncle's last for reasons that will be obvious later. And this one was actually pretty serious for his unit and for his station. He had been assigned to tail a fellow officer that was accused of dealing, and he had to take the case very delicately, as he needed to prove that this guy was guilty, and not let him know that he was being investigated. My uncle said that they followed him for a while, and while it was certainly a struggle, they did get a hold of the evidence that he was dealing. The problem was, since this guy was a cop, he wasn't willing to deal with just anybody. From what they had gathered, he had specific people that he would work with, and they didn't really have the ability to get a deal on tape or anything. My uncle told me that they tailed him for a long time, and they finally decided to just arrest him. He determined that he would do so in a secluded area, and would do anything he could to not make it a big scene. Of course, being an officer, there's a whole honor thing, and he decided that he would offer the guy a chance to come clean and willingly go in. My uncle said that he followed the guy until, at one point, he went into one of the locker room areas, and he decided that that would be the point where he would confront him. He mentioned that he went in, and he started the conversation casually until the room was cleared out. Then he basically confronted the guy and said, "Look, we have a case against you. We have all the evidence that we need, and it would be best if you just turned yourself in without causing a fuss." Basically, like I said, just giving this guy a chance to go in willingly. He says that, at the beginning, this guy acted like he was going to go with my uncle. But the second my uncle's guard was down, he pulled a knife and jammed it into my uncle's shoulder. My uncle fell from the scuffle and, well, being stabbed. But this guy couldn't have chosen a worse course of action, and a worse point in time. As soon as he stabbed my uncle, another officer entered the locker room and saw what had happened. My uncle doesn't remember much of it, but apparently the guy ended up with a round in him and the entire station went into a frenzy. They both pulled through, though my uncle lost a majority of the use of his right arm. The other officer went in for attempted murder charges, I believe, seeing as how he attacked my uncle with an obvious intention to hurt him. In the end, they found out that this guy was actually pulling items from the evidence locker to sell. He was using what had been confiscated for his own profit. While this may not have been the most terrifying story, it's one that my uncle will never forget, because this guy could have absolutely murdered him then and there. It's just likely that he had panicked, and he went for a stab instead of anything that would have actually done my uncle in. My uncle admits that he went about this really stupid, and that he should have had backup, or just said screw the honor system and taken him in out in the lobby. Either way, he went to prison, and he won't be out for a very long time. My uncle now does desk work for the station, so it is unlikely that he'll ever end up getting stabbed again. This story happened what feels like a really long time ago. I was still new into my job as a paramedic and had yet to be beaten down by the stresses that come with the job. Honestly, it's a good job, but it will wear you down. Working for 12-hour shifts at some point, running around, getting consistent blasts of adrenaline because of the calls, it will age you so much quicker than other jobs. I cannot tell you how many days off I slept through because I was completely and totally exhausted from my shifts. Honestly, it's enough to destroy your personal relationships, which is where we can segue into the context for the story. Back when I was a rookie paramedic, I was dating a rookie police officer named Laura. Laura was an incredibly energetic, spry, and fun-loving girl that I genuinely loved. And she was probably one of the nicest people that I've met in all my years on this earth. Laura actually joined the force because of her father, Paul, who was a sergeant in the same department, and he'd been on the force for quite a while. I don't remember how long, but he was pretty well known and well respected throughout our small town. I actually knew Paul from when I was a medic, prior to dating Laura, so when I met her and we started dating, it was actually quite the surprise for me when I found out that they were related. Regardless, he knew that I had a good head on my shoulders and a steady job, so he was okay with us being together. Anyways, now that you know who I am and who they are, it's probably best to get to the actual story/situation. Like most paramedic stories, this one isn't one that's scary per se, but it's terrifying in its own right. On the night of this situation, I had been working a full 12-hour shift, and I was tired. I was actually scheduled to be off the next day, so I was ready for it to come to an end. The night had actually been fairly busy, considering it was the middle of the week. I think I'd already been on 2 calls in the evening alone, and the other pair had already been sent out twice. And while the calls we had taken weren't that big of a deal, it was a lot more than I was used to having to deal with. Because of this, I was hopeful that we would have a silent remainder of the evening, and I would be able to do nothing for the last hour of my shift. I know this sounds lazy, but trust me, when you're running around for 5 or so hours taking care of various things around town, it's enough to make you want to sleep while driving. Of course, that's not how things work in reality. And with around 45 minutes left of an exhausting shift, we get a high-priority call. I'm sitting there and listening to the dispatch inform us of the situation as we're getting everything together to get out as quickly as possible. The whole thing was a pretty horrible mess, apparently. We were informed that we were responding to a shots fired, potential injury at a domestic call. The initial call that the officers had taken was one where a woman had called the police on her husband because he was drunk and had hit her. The location was actually a frequent call, one that the officers had gone to a number of times, and the situation typically ended up with the husband going to jail for a couple of days, getting out with a court date, but the wife would not leave him. I know that the cycle of abuse is very real, and these kinds of relationships are really hard to get out of, but it's really painful to see these kinds of things recur like this. Unfortunately, and obviously, this time things had gone south. There were shots fired with injury, and obviously we were headed in that direction as fast as we humanly could. It wasn't close, but we were still making pretty good time overall. It wasn't until we were about halfway there that the call changed from shots fired potential injury to shots fired officer down. This kind of escalation turns the entire situation from a big deal to a huge deal. We now had an officer that was in need of immediate medical attention and possibly other injuries. We pulled up to the scene, and we jumped out when we saw a second team of officers had already secured the scene and were trying to help out the downed officer. While I anticipated this to be a terrible situation, I could feel my heart stopping when I saw Paul on the ground in a pool of blood. I ran over to him and I started to do everything I could to stop the bleeding, but I knew immediately that there was nothing I could do. He'd been shot on the left side of his neck, and he was already fading at that point. I remember grabbing his hand and kneeling down and telling the officer to hold pressure. The look in his eyes when he saw me is something that will stick with me until the day that I die. It was almost like a glimmer of hope. He knew me, so I think part of him had become relaxed when he saw me approaching. Either he started to think he was going to be okay, or he knew that he was a goner, and at that point he didn't feel alone. Like I said, I tried to keep him there, and we tried to get him into the ambulance while maintaining, but he passed away while we were headed to the hospital. Apparently the call had gone bad within the first few minutes of Paul showing up. The husband was, as the wife had reported, drunk and mad at the world. When Paul showed up, he expected the whole thing to go as it had gone in the past. The husband would fight for a bit, but would eventually end up in cuffs and in the cell for a day or two. What he didn't expect was that the husband was going to be completely off it and shoot his wife dead, while Paul was knocking on the front door. From what I was told, this guy murdered his wife, and then when he saw Paul, he shot him from the window and then turned the gun on himself. Talking to Laura was nearly impossible after this whole thing had happened, because there was nothing that I could do, and I had to just watch him die. I tried to talk to her about it, and tell her that he wasn't in pain. I tried to tell her that he was definitely at peace when it happened, but it didn't do much. I don't blame her for not wanting to hear all of the standard statements. Laura and I split up pretty soon after. We kind of just grew distant. And I think that she didn't want to be around me anymore after this whole thing happened. Again, I don't blame her. She also quit the force within the next month. I actually have no idea what happened to her after this, and I'm sure that she took a lot of time to actually get in a good place mentally. I just hope that if Laura is out there, she's living to the best of her abilities, and she was able to keep going strong, if not just for herself, then for Paul. Back in the early 2000s, I worked in a gas station rest stop that was off of a highway. It was one of those stops that was in the middle of nowhere that you see as the single stop for the next 100 miles. So, it was quite the drive getting there and going home, but it was also quiet for the most part. You can get some weirdos crossing the state line, but it's always nice knowing you probably won't see the same person again, outside of truckers maybe. Sometimes my husband would come in on his days off and sit up in one of the booths reading or something while I worked. I remember this event happening in the summer because it was so hot, so I had the fans on near the front door just to keep cool since I would be close to the door. My husband wasn't feeling well, so he had stayed home, but there were two other people working. An older woman, Rosa, who worked in the kitchen area, where we make the hot foods, and the other cashier, Evan. Rosa had left as we closed the food station at 9, so it was just going to be the two of us. Again, with our location, and it being as late as it was, we didn't really get a lot of customers. More so, it would be people coming in to buy a phone charger, use the restroom, and sleep in the parking lot. It wasn't uncommon to see cars parked, but we still kept an eye on them for our safety. On this night, Evan had just walked away to get something to eat and to take a short break. I was up front sitting behind the register reading when a few people had walked in. By this time it was around 11, so the first couple to walk in looked exhausted. They were looking at energy drinks and donuts, and all I could do was chuckle to myself, knowing that they were going to crash soon. While they were looking around, I saw another person walk in. Because the door makes a sound when it's opened, I looked over immediately to see them, and she turned her face away quickly as she started fidgeting with her hair. It was a woman who appeared to be by herself, but she stood out to me, because she was wearing a hoodie and sweatpants. Like I mentioned, it was summer, and it was hot. The state that I'm in is known for being hot and miserably humid, so I thought that it was odd, especially because she didn't look cold. In fact, it looked like she was sweating, so maybe she was ill? She looked like she hadn't brushed her hair either, but was trying to run her fingers through it and pull it around her face. Again, we can get some oddballs, so I didn't think anything else of it, other than to just watch and make sure that she didn't steal anything. After walking around a few of the aisles, she came up and, while trying to avoid eye contact, she asked where the restrooms were. I noticed when she approached that she didn't really look well. Her face was pale, her lips were dry and cracked, and she was, in fact, sweating. I asked her if she was okay, and she smiled slightly, saying that she was just carsick. I let it go, as it was none of my business as long as she wasn't in danger or anything, and I pointed her to the restrooms. The restrooms are on the little diner/food side, so she had to walk towards the other side to get there. We had one of those corner mirrors hanging, so we could see people coming and going from that direction, though. I watched her walk over there and head down that hall with no issues. A couple minutes later, the first couple walked up with like 6 different energy drinks, the donuts, and 2 bottles of water. I remembered this because I teased them about the water to caffeine ratio and convinced them to buy more water. I speak from experience, after all. We joked and talked a bit about where they were from and where they were headed, and they mentioned how they grossly underestimated how much they would spend on gas. They gave me a 10 to put towards their tank, and they left. Shortly after, Evan came back up from break, and we started talking about the couple that came in when the phone rang. There was a phone up front that was usually only used by us employees to call in, or when we needed to make a call, management when they would ask to remind us to do something, and, of course, emergencies. It was the manager, calling and asking us how it was going and to check if Rosa turned off all the fryers and oven, as she'd forgotten a few times before. I remembered this because the kitchen is creepy when it's closed, because it gets really dark, and all you can hear is the AC/heater blowers, or faint talking from the front, so what else does a lady do but ask the guy to go do it? I stayed there and started reading again, when Evan came back up in one piece, thankfully, and turned on the small TV that we had behind the counter. It had been a few hours of us sitting, walking around, getting a customer here and there when we had one lady walk in, and again ask for the restrooms. As she started walking into the back, I remembered the lady in the hoodie because I never saw her leave. I started asking Evan if he had seen her when the woman had come running back to the front, saying there was a baby in the restroom. I remember I just paused for a second to register what she had said when she clarified. There's a newborn in there, alone. I immediately rushed to the restroom, and in the stall was a newborn. In the toilet. It looked like someone had tried to cover the poor thing with toilet paper and the seat covers. I have a daughter. She's a teen now, but I remember when she was born and it being the best feeling in the world, so this made my heart drop. I immediately grabbed the baby and noticed that she wasn't breathing. She was cold and almost a purplish color. I took her to the sink and tried my best to run some warm water on her to clean her up, and I did my best with CPR. I was so worried that I was going to hurt her or that I was too late, but she finally started crying. I was relieved, but still in shock as I held this baby with no sign of her mother. I picked her up and immediately ran to the front, asking Evan to grab towels from the kitchen as I grabbed the phone to call 911. When Evan came back, he looked just as confused as I did at first. I wrapped the baby up the best that I could, and I got her to stop crying. The woman that found her said that she had just opened the stall and saw her there, but there was no one else in sight. She was the only person that had asked for the restroom since the woman in the hoodie. That's when it dawned on me that she probably looked the way she did because she was going into labor. But if so, she left without me even seeing her. And how long was she in there? We didn't even hear someone, and believe me, labor is not a silent thing. With our location, the ambulance didn't arrive fast, but it also felt like an eternity holding this baby, trying to comfort her, knowing that one of the first faces she's seen, she may never see again. With the ambulance and police there, they took our statements, and that's when I really started feeling awful. We didn't even see the car that the woman was in. We didn't know where she was coming from, where she was going. She could have been in a completely different state by this point. We did have cameras set up, so we had to give that to the police, but unfortunately the one side was the only one that recorded, and none of the parking lot was live, and didn't save, so we didn't have car information. Before they left, the paramedic did tell me that the baby seemed fine, and that I most likely saved her life. I don't know if they ever found the mom, but I hope that the girl is doing okay. After that, I actually took a CPR class and paid more attention to my customers and their comings and goings. I want to add a content warning for this story, as some of the language is very descriptive, and it involves a car accident and the damage done during said car accident, and it is kind of graphic, so just a heads up on that. So, I've been a career paramedic, but this happened when I had only been one for 5 years. This has never left me to this day, and I kid you not, it happened exactly like this. I was driving home on a rural highway one rainy afternoon. It was really pouring and traffic had slowed to about 50 miles per hour. I was following two vehicles and we rounded a bend in the road as a small sports car on the opposite side crossed the center line and hit the small SUV that was leading the three of us vehicles on my side of the road. I immediately pulled over and called 911. It was a bad one. I got out to check on everyone. There was a wailing coming from the SUV on the side of the road. That's always a good thing because it means people are breathing. So I went down into the field past the ditch to check on the sports car. There were two young guys in the car. The force of the impact had driven the engine to where the front passenger seat should be. The passenger was still buckled, his crumpled hand grabbing the crap handle overhead. The entire section of the car shoved into the back seat area. The back of the car had peeled away, as had the passenger's top of his head. His jawbone jutted out raw and jagged, and he was clearly deceased. But I felt for a pulse anyway, all while listening to the gasping, ragged, and dragging breaths of the driver. No pulse on the passenger. I tried to figure out how to deal with the driver, but there was nothing that I could do. The car had literally wrapped around him, and it would take an extrication team to get him out. Listening to his dying breathing, I apologized out loud to him that I couldn't do more. I told him I was sorry to leave him, but that others needed my help too. In my heart, I knew that he would never make it, so I went to render aid where it was needed. In triage, we call this black tagging. It's a patient who isn't going to survive. I did what I could for the family in the SUV. Emergency medical people and fire services got to the scene and took over. The entire family had injuries, but all survived. The mother did have permanent brain damage, and she lost an eye. But the whole day, those two guys in the red sports car stayed on my mind. That night, I was home alone and getting ready for bed with just the bedside lamp on, and I heard something in the hallway. It got louder as it came closer to the dark hallway towards my open door. It was like a thump, drag, thump, drag. I absolutely froze. A broken hand curled around the frame of my doorway, and then that kid from the passenger seat was standing there, busted up like he was in the car, and I'm totally serious. He looked at me, and I can't recall the exact words of what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "Hey, my friend wants you to know that he understands. He wants you to know that he's okay. We both are. Thanks for trying." He stood there for a few more seconds just looking at me, and then he stepped back into the shadows, let go of the door frame, and I listened to him drag back down the hallway into nothing. I turned on every damn light that I could. I slept with the lights on for 2 full weeks. I clipped out their death notices from the paper later that week. Turns out, they were both high school seniors, on their way home from a wrestling tournament. Their car had hydroplaned from what the investigation determined. I'd never have recognized the blonde-headed kid had he come to me as his healthy, unwrecked self. This freaked me the hell out that he came to me busted up. I still have the newspaper clippings, and I'll never forget them, nor the ghostly visit. Anyway, that's my experience. I've seen a lot of stuff in my 29-year career, but nothing quite that visceral before, nor since. I have been working as a gas station attendant for quite a while. Somewhere close to 10 years. Mostly because I have a record, and I had some demons in my past that made me struggle with living a normal life. And that said, I am clean and healthy again, but working at my local station has almost been therapeutic. It's not a terribly difficult job. It's not overly demanding, the pay is enough for what I need, and I get to talk to various people that I both want and don't want to know. That, and I just get to do my job, and not be bothered with too much. And it's tough to get fired. The more I talk about it, the more I realize that I really do like this job, which may sound weird, but I'm kind of weird. Anyways, all that aside, I've been doing this for a long time. Like I said, and I haven't had too much happen that's been too terribly crazy. We've been robbed once when I wasn't working, and the police were there within literal seconds. The guy got shot, but survived, and after that, we were pretty much never hit again. We actually still have a bullet hole in the back wall from where one of the officer's rounds hit. It's a good conversation piece for newbies at the very least. It's a good way to say to them, look, this isn't the safest job in the world, and stuff happens, but you're more likely to get attacked walking out in the street than you are behind the thick plastic that we have between ourselves and the customer. So, all that aside, let's get into the one major event that made me dislike this job just a little bit. It's less of a scary story and more like an unsettling event/situation to be put in. Plus, it kind of messed with my head, to be honest. It all started on a Thursday night, which is not a busy night for our station. We usually get around 70% of our foot traffic Friday through Sunday, so I was pretty tired and bored with the night. Anyways, we get a customer that walks in the door, and I immediately knew it was going to be a problem. This guy looked incredibly familiar to me, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he recognized me. For most people, that wouldn't be an issue. For me, that meant that he was probably a druggie, and I most likely knew him from back when I was a user. Based on his appearance, which I know I really shouldn't do, he was a user. When you work in retail and when you know those kind of people, you tend to watch them to make sure they aren't shoving things into their pockets. I was watching this guy like a hawk, keeping my eyes on him and on the camera screens. To my surprise, he didn't do anything bad. He didn't take anything. He just grabbed some chips, candy, a Red Bull, and a few other things. Then he walked up to the counter and gave me a mostly toothless smile. Being as polite as I could, I asked how he was that evening, just trying to make small talk and keep it shallow. He tells me he's doing all right. I start scanning his items and then turn to tell him his total, and he smacks the counter with his hand, making me jump. As soon as he does this, he shouts, "Wait a minute, Daniel! I knew I recognized you, Danny! How you been, man?" Which, again, it was something that I was hoping wouldn't happen. I've been clean for a long time. I've avoided these kinds of people for years and have been trying to keep myself on the straight and narrow. I told him that I was doing good and that I was just chugging along, keeping clean and working hard. He laughed and told me that he was trying to stay off the junk as well, and that it was difficult. I agreed. I told him that it takes time and a lot of willpower, but it's worth it. I told him that ever since I stopped using, life became more clear, and I realized what damage I was doing to myself. I knew that it was probably preachy, but I was hopeful that I could get him to see that being clean was important. After a bit more of me trying to convince him that being clean was worth it, and even mentioning that I could give him the name of a great rehab center in the area, he literally asks me if I know where he can score some heroin. I just paused and stared at him. My jaw clenched, and my eyes half closed. He realized that he had just asked someone that had been clean for years where he could get drugs. I know that he realized because he said that he was sorry and that it was out of line. Which should have been enough, but honestly, he kind of hit a nerve. I didn't say much more. I just finished bagging his stuff and told him to have a good night, in a manner that could be seen as cold. I felt bad, but at the same time, you don't ask a former addict, one that worked hard to get clean, if they can help you score a hit. You just don't do it. After he left, I kind of just forgot about him. I moved on with my night. We had a few more customers, but overall the night was pretty standard. I rang up everyone, stocked the shelves when I could, and pretty much just killed the hours doing some cleaning. About 4 or 5 hours later, my second person came in for the end of my shift, so I could go ahead and start doing the outdoor cleaning. The trash, the pumps, cleaning up the lot. Anyways, Jay gets in, he clocks in, I run the count on the register and put it in the book in the back, and I inform him that I'm going to take out the trash. So, he takes over the register. I get all the bags ready and I head out to the back towards where the dumpster is. I throw the first bag in, and the sound seems off. It sounded like there was something in the dumpster. It may sound really dumb, but after doing this for damn near a decade, there are patterns and things like that sort of click in your head. They empty the dumpsters midday around here on Thursdays, so it should have been empty. And the trash usually makes a decent thump in the empty dumpster. This time, it didn't. It sounded like it hit something soft at the bottom. My first thought was that maybe they didn't pick up the trash earlier, which would have been an issue, as the owner pays for that service. I sighed, and I put my foot up on the rung to look in the dumpster, and I see him. The guy that came into the store a few hours prior. The guy that asked me where he could get some heroin was lying on the bottom of the dumpster and clearly blitzed out of his mind. He even still had the cloth on his arm. I was livid. This guy had seriously jumped in our dumpster to shoot up. He seriously had the audacity to do this after everything that I had said to him. I threw the second bag of trash off to the side and went back into the store, then told Jay to call the cops. I told him that some junkie had shot up in the dumpster and passed out, and that we needed the cops and probably a medic. He called 911, and I told him to wait out front for the cops, and that I would take over the store until then. He did as I asked. I also called the boss to let them know what was going on, and he said that he would be there in about 30 minutes. This whole time, I'm just fuming at the fact that I told this guy that I knew from back when I was hooked on drugs, all about how I got clean, how life was worth it, and how he should look into getting help, and even gave him the name of the facility that I went through. And then he felt it was okay to get trashed in our trash. My anger was, best way to put it, short-lived when the paramedics showed up. I expected them to just pull him out, wheel him up on the stretcher, and get him to the ER. Then, I noticed that, with the stretcher, they pulled out one of those plastic body bags. My rage immediately shifted to a deep sense of pity. Jay came back in with the boss and one of the officers, and they asked questions, obviously. I told him that he came in earlier and bought some stuff and that we chatted. I told him that I had actually recognized him from back when I was an addict, but that I was clean and hadn't seen him for at least 10 years. They then informed me that they found the candy and a half-empty chip bag on his person, along with a card that I had written the number for the rehab facility on. They also informed me that he had pretty much for certain died from an overdose. That he probably just overdid it and passed out, and then didn't wake up. Honestly, this was a terrible situation. And while I was upset that he went and did that, I was just as depressed over the fact that I was probably the last person this guy talked to. I know there was nothing more that I could do, and I feel like had this guy woken up in the morning and saw the card with the number when he was sober, he might have gone and gotten help. Of course, we'll never know. And it really does haunt me that, had I not gotten clean when I did, that could have been me in that situation. I really do feel bad that he passed away, but users all know the risk when they push that needle in. I really do hope that he found peace on the other side. I'm a paramedic, and I have been for what feels like forever, though it's only been about 4 or 5 years. I just want to say that being a paramedic will absolutely tear you apart mentally and age you faster than almost any other career path. Is it fulfilling? Absolutely. I love helping people, but there's also points in time where you are expected to help, and there's literally nothing you can do in the situation. Those are the ones that get you the worst. In my time riding in the back of an ambulance, I've seen some really messed up stuff. I've seen a lot of death, a lot of blood, and genuinely a lot of chaos and pain. And as much as I hate it, it really does make it worth it when you're able to save even just one person from a terrible situation. The story here is one of the stories that absolutely had a lasting impression on me, and is more of a sad story than a scary one, but it fits into the paramedic horror stories theme, just in a different form of horror. So, the story happened in my second year of being a paramedic, which would have been around 2016, maybe early 2017. I was already in the middle of my shift, so I was already in the swing of things, and it was a slow night, which is a good thing when you do my line of work. We were on standby, just kind of waiting for a call, when we finally get one over the radio. Dispatch pings us and tells me that there's a high priority call a couple of miles down the way from where we are. They tell us that the caller sounds like they're young, and that they informed the emergency line that their mom was on the floor and wasn't responding to them. This isn't the kind of call that you want to get, but it happens. Sometimes parents work themselves into such a heavy fatigue that they legitimately pass out. There are also 100 other conditions that can lead to unconsciousness. Blood pressure issues, diabetes, anemia, etc. So, while this kind of call starts off with the worst case scenario in mind, you have to keep your hopes up, and keep all possibilities in mind. Within a couple of minutes, we're on the road with lights and sirens going. We're driving as fast as we safely can, and trying to get past the cars that seem to not want to move for us. Which, if I may drop an aside here, if you see an ambulance on the road with their lights and sirens going, get the hell out of the way. You not moving could literally be what causes someone's death, so stop with whatever is in your head that makes you think you don't have to move over, and just move. I know that most people are good about this, but it pisses me off when I see people that seriously think they are more important than a damn ambulance. Anyways, we were on the road for this critical call, and we were getting there as quickly as we possibly could. The GPS gets us to the house. It's a one-floor style ranch house in a decent neighborhood. There isn't a car in the driveway and the front door is closed. We park out front, I grab the defibrillator kit just in case, and we make a quick jog towards the front door and knock. A few seconds later, a little girl that couldn't have been any older than 5 or 6 answers the door. Her face is a bright red, and she's very obviously been bawling her eyes out. As soon as I saw her, I got hit with a super deep palpitation. Thankfully, my partner was a veteran and had been doing this for way longer than I had, so he had a better head on his shoulders when it came to these situations. He leaned down to her and said, "Hi there. We're here because someone called saying their mom wasn't feeling well. Was that you?" The little girl nodded her head and said that her mother was in the kitchen. She opened the door further and let us in, and then led us through the living room and into the kitchen. As soon as we saw the mother, I knew that this was going to be a worst-case scenario. The stove was on, with whatever it was that she was making starting to smoke, and she was face down on the floor with her eyes rolled back. My partner told me to take the little girl into the living room, and that he would call in for backup so that we could secure the scene and get the situation figured out. Basically, since it was just the two of us, I had to keep the child occupied while he attempted to resuscitate, if he could. Though we both knew that it wasn't going to happen. At this point, I'm in the living room trying to keep this little girl that's in a state of panic because she has no idea what's going on from completely losing it. The first thing she asks me is if her mom is going to be alright. I kind of just sat there for a moment before telling her that we were going to do everything we could to help her. It absolutely killed me to lie to her like that. I tried to pull the subject away from the situation a little bit, and I asked her for her name. She told me that her name was Chloe, that she was about to be 6 years old next week. I tried to ask if she could remember what happened, and she told me that her mom was making dinner and then said that she didn't feel good, and then she was lying down on the floor. When she went to wake her up, she wasn't responding, so she called 911 on the phone. I told her that she did the right thing, and that what she did was very brave. Then, I asked her where her dad was. She told me that he was at work, because apparently he worked nights. This left me with a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, just thinking that this man went to work and left his daughter and wife at home, and that he had no idea what was happening at home right that moment. When the secondary paramedics and the police unit showed up to my house, I took Chloe outside with one of the officers, and they asked the neighbors if they had any contact information for the father. At this point, the officers took over the scene and took care of Chloe as they tried to get a hold of her dad. I told her that she did a great job, and I pretty much had to let it go at that point. I went with my partner and the secondaries with her mother to the hospital, but she was pronounced DOA. In the end, the situation was heartbreaking. The father was notified, and he showed up at the home with a look of absolute disbelief on his face. And I don't blame him. Like I said, he went to work like any other day of his life. Any other day. Only to be called back home and told that his wife was dead, and that he was now a single parent. I later found out that she was, as expected, gone when we got there. She'd apparently had a major stroke while she was making dinner, and she collapsed. Her daughter called 911 immediately like she should have, but there was literally nothing that we could have done. This is one of those stories that made me second-guess my career path. I kept with it in the end, and I hope that I never have anything like this happen again, so long as I'm doing this. But I'm sure it will. To all the listeners out there, make sure that your loved ones know that you love them, and make sure that they know that you care, and cherish each and every moment you get with them. Never take any of it for granted. So, I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours away, up a really windy and mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station, and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell phone reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple. But my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well working up there. There was one night that he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird mucusy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so he knew it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe he was telling the truth. Now, for my story. I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early, because we were going to have a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room on the double white trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but felt awake still. And I hear one of my coworkers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning to me, and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me. "Get the F out here." I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving, while they yelled at me. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but it was still weird. So, these two stories aren't mine directly. They're actually stories I've been told by my dad from his 20-some-odd years as a police officer in southern Michigan. Working for the force that long will absolutely net you a number of stories. But I recall two of them specifically that bothered him, and strangely both of them were on the roads. Actually, thinking back, a lot of the stories that he had to tell were about drivers or car accidents. It makes sense, though. A lot of terrible things happen while people are driving around. And far too many people out there drive with zero regard for the safety of others. Anyways, this first story is a testament to the fact that you should always wear your seatbelt regardless of how uncomfortable it makes you. On top of that, you should take even further precautions when it's snowy or cold. My father was on his shift and was patrolling when he got a call of a rollover accident in an area that he was near, and the call-out informed that there were potential injuries. Seeing as how he's not a medic, his job on this call was to basically get to the scene, secure it, and attempt any basic assistance to anyone injured. He hit his lights and guns it out to where the crash was reported, and he saw it at the corner of the main road and a side road. He parks his car to block traffic in that section and runs over to the car. From what he always told me, this was a sedan, something like a Dodge Neon, and it was still upside down. Even worse, the driver in the car was completely out of it. At this point, he's trying to see if the driver is even still alive, checking for his pulse, checking for breathing, when the man wakes up. My dad is trying to ask him if he can hear him, just trying to get a response out of him, and when he finally responds, my dad said that the words were completely incoherent. And that's when my dad realized the smell. This guy is 3 sheets to the wind, completely trashed, and barely conscious. My dad's just trying to get this guy to the point where he can help him out of the car, when out of nowhere he hears a kid screaming. As soon as this starts, the driver freaks out and starts yelling about his son. He looks in the back of the car and there's no one else in it, which then led to the assumption that the kid had been thrown from the car. My dad gets up and goes to look for the son, and he finds him in a decent-sized snowbank. He's barely moving, but screaming his lungs out and crying in pain. My dad runs over and kneels by him. Obviously, this kid is scared and hurt, and he's trying to get up, but my dad keeps telling him that it'll be okay and that he needs to not move, just in case he had a head or neck injury. From what he said, the kid didn't look like he was in good condition, but the fact that he was conscious enough to cry and yell and tell him that he was hurting was a good thing. Obviously, this situation wasn't good, and the end result was pretty terrible. The father was fine. He wasn't hurt at all. The son had a broken leg and a concussion, but he made a full recovery. That was the good part of it all. The bad part of it was that the father, as stated, was completely trashed at around 4 in the afternoon and was driving with his son in the front seat without a seatbelt, and the roads were not in good condition, hence the snowbank I mentioned. My dad never figured out how the guy ended up rolling the car, but when he did, the son had apparently gone out the window, and thankfully the car didn't roll on top of him. This was a pretty awful situation that ended with a decent ending. The father was obviously charged and the kid removed from his custody, but it could have gone much, much worse. This second story does not have a happy ending. And if you are sensitive to grim or gruesome stories, I don't recommend reading it. I'll keep the details low, that way it doesn't become too much for those of you that do read it. The story actually happened closer to the beginning of him working for the Force, and it's one that has absolutely haunted him. Based on what he'd said, he was patrolling like any other day, when he actually saw what was a jumper on a nearby bridge down onto a highway traffic. He said that he actually saw the whole thing from where he was stopped, and again, I won't get into the graphic detail, but he said that there was a young woman on the bridge, and he knew what she was thinking about doing. As soon as he grabbed his radio to call it in, he saw her jump down onto the road, and then saw a semi try to swerve out of the way. Obviously, this doesn't work with a large truck like that, and he couldn't move quick enough, but her act actually took more than just her own life. When the truck tried to swerve, he actually ended up hitting another car that was beside him. My dad said that the damage to the second car was an indication that there was zero chance that the driver could have made it out of this accident alive. So, while it is sad that the first person decided to end their own life, and yes, I wholeheartedly think that's a terrible thing to happen, her method ended up taking the life of someone else that had nothing to do with her, or her decision. In the end, my dad said that the truck driver was traumatized. He had attempted to not hit the girl, but ended up taking someone else's life too, completely by accident. This whole thing was a wrong place, wrong time situation, and there's no way to not feel horrible for the guy. I can imagine the years of therapy that he had to go through to get past this in his mind, and I really do hope that he was able to move forward with his own life. So, that, my friends, was a collection of technically gas station and line of duty stories. We're just going to call it true scary stories right now. It's not like my standard true scary story collections where they're submitted to me or just a grab bag. This was two very specific themes. I pulled these stories specifically because they were some of the most intense stories I have ever read, and they're old. They're older whenever it comes to my channel at least. So I felt they deserved a little more respect than what they got back then. I'll be the first to admit that I haven't always been the best narrator. I try my best, I always have, but for a while I really didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I think it took me a while to find my voice, so to give these stories a fresh coat of paint, if you will, and present them to the world now that there are so many more of you, I think it's a good idea. Maybe it's not, I don't know. Either way, this is my first remade collection of stories like this. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. My intent is whenever I redo stories like this, because I have 2 more set up on this list that I'm looking at, I intend to do around an hour's worth of stories. So I'm not just remaking a 20 to 40 minute long video, I'm remaking an hour's worth of stories each time. So it's not just short videos of remade stories, they're extended collections, if you will. So hopefully it works out. Hopefully you all like it. If not, well, I won't do it too much, but I intend to do a few of them this month, and then we'll see how it goes in September. So, yeah. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. That would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing, and also welcome. You heard stories that were redone in 2023 from 2020 and 2021, so, yeah. You can also leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts on the whole thing, on the idea to redo these stories. Another idea that was offered to me, sorry, I know I'm tangenting here, was to do remade stories alongside new stories. And if that's an idea that you guys like, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll consider it. These 3 that I have planned are going to just be remade, but after that, in September, I may very well do a mix of old and new, and that way you guys can enjoy them as, you know, full collections, as full parts of videos, and such and so on. Yeah, just let me know what you think. I'm gathering opinions here, so comment down below with that. You can also get early access with Patreon memberships, depending on how you sign up, what you sign up for. You can do a super thanks, which is just a tip to the channel, just supports the channel a little extra. I think that's everything. Well, anyway, I hope you're all having a beautiful week, and I hope you're all having a lovely day. I said that backwards, but that's okay. That rhymed. Nice. And I hope that I do see you again here very soon, and I will, trust me. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and please don't forget it. And until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.